One day you came into my mind and everything looked as though it was all mine.
Alright, Thrill Seekers, that was a little bit of a song called Thoughts and Words by the Byrds from their Younger Than Yesterday album that I just put together the other day. Thought you might enjoy that. I wanted to talk to you about a quote from one of my favorite guys, Nisargadatta Maharaj, author of a book called I Am That. And in the book I Am That, somebody asks him why he never started an ashram of his own. And in case you don't know much about Nisargadatta Maharaj was an Indian guy who he owned a bunch of sort of little cigarette shops. I guess they're sort of like the Indian equivalent of convenience stores, like little tiny bodegas, maybe is what you call them. And sometime in when he was in his 30s, he decided he wanted to understand the meaning of life. He went off, kind of abandoned his cigarette shops, and found a guru and spent 3 years practicing. Had a big awakening experience and then came back. In the meanwhile, all but one of his cigarette shops had gone out of business, and he just went back to running the one cigarette shop that was left, and he had an apartment on top of it, just above it, on the second floor, I guess. And then he would receive visitors and he would talk about his spiritual experiences with these visitors. But he never established a formal ashram of his own or anything besides just talking to people in apparently like his living room. And so somebody asked him why he never established a formal ashram. And he said, "The moment I establish an institution, I become a prisoner of that institution." And I really like that statement because I think it's true. I think it's unavoidable. And it's something that I discovered for myself, and it kind of relates to what I was trying to talk about last week, because I'm kind of puzzled by how do these things happen? For example, what I was talking about last week, how does somebody like the Dalai Lama, who is, I assume, a very spiritual guy who's interested in the deeper truths of life. I'm assuming he's really interested in Buddhist truth and, finding the meaning of life and everything. And he's a sincere spiritual guy. I don't think he's a phony or anything like that. How does he get so wrapped up in things that he ends up supporting Shoko Asahara, who is a mass murderer? Now we can say that the Dalai Lama didn't know that Shoko Asahara was going to go on to be a mass murderer, but anybody who took a look at Shoko Asahara's literature or paid even a small amount, I've got Ziggy's watching me while I'm talking here. I don't know if you could get a shot of that there. Ziggy, are you my audience today? Hi. He's watching me do my talk today. So anyway, he didn't know Shoko Asahara was going to put poison gas on the Tokyo subway systems, obviously, but anybody who paid the least bit of attention, and you didn't have to pay much attention at all to Shoko Asahara's literature, would know that this guy wasn't what he presented himself as. He wasn't a true Buddhist master or anything like that, and he wasn't spreading Buddhism in Japan or anything like Buddhism. He was spreading kind of this crazy culty stuff. And a lot of people had warned the Dalai Lama that it was dangerous stuff, and the guy was involved in a lot of crazy things and giving his people drugs and even murder and all this stuff was going on while the Dalai Lama was supporting him. And I don't think a lot of people really understand how this game works. People have been commenting that he wasn't really supporting Shoko Asahara. We're just posing for pictures. If you're the Dalai Lama, that has a lot of influence. Like, I couldn't get together with the Dalai Lama and pose for a picture with him, and don't think that wouldn't do my career a hell of a lot of good. If I could have put on the back cover of Hardcore Zen a picture of me and the Dalai Lama, you don't think I would have sold a lot more books? That would have made a huge difference, and it made a huge difference to Shoko Asahara being able to publish multiple pictures of himself with the Dalai Lama showing that they were buddies. So how does somebody get so involved in that? Where does this happen? How do you go from being a spiritual seeker to getting so deeply involved in this? to where you're meeting with guys like that and taking their money? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the institutions and how you get so wrapped up. Now, there was a discussion I saw on Twitter with Philip Goff, who's a guy who's real big into panpsychism. And I'm not going to try to explain panpsychism because I don't really understand panpsychism all that well. I tried to do a few videos about it a couple of years ago, and I think I really didn't explain it very well because I didn't understand it very well. This discussion on Twitter was something like, it went something like this. A football team, for example, it doesn't matter if it's American football or European football, is composed of conscious entities, but the football team itself is not a conscious entity. And I commented, and nobody seemed to notice this comment, but here was my comment. My comment was, I used to agree with statements like that, but nowadays, I'm not so sure that's true. Because I've seen, for example, Zen centers behave as if they are conscious entities of their own. And what happens often with these kind of centers, these institutions, these religious institutions, and this happens with other institutions other than religious institutions, but I know it from seeing it happen with religious institutions, is you can have a case where every single member of that religious institution, of that Zen center, for example, disagrees with some policy, doesn't want to do some policy. And yet, because the institution seems to want that policy becomes enacted and becomes a thing that gets pushed. And the institution seems to have a mind of its own that is in some ways separate from the individual minds that make it up. It's this weird phenomenon I've seen in action. And I want to give you an example of it, but I feel like when I give this example, it's going to generate a lot of talk in the comments that's going to go the wrong way, but here goes anyhow. This happened a few years ago at the Angel City Zen Center when I was part of the Angel City Zen Center, which I am no longer part of the Angel City Zen Center, so anybody who asks about that, I have nothing to do with the Angel City Zen Center anymore, and this is kind of part of the reason. It was decided among the board of directors at the Angel City Zen Center that we absolutely had to have a written policy governing what to do about romantic involvements between priests and students. Now, I disagreed that I said we didn't need to have a written policy about that. And I'm supposed to be the head of this organization. And I said we didn't need to have that. But nobody wanted to listen to me. Now, I know some of you are out there probably going, well, you do need to have that. You absolutely need to have that. Well, look, I think if you're an institution like the San Francisco Zen Center, where you've got dozens, if maybe even hundreds, I'm not sure how many priests there are in the San Francisco Zen Center, but you've got a lot of priests. And you've got 3 abbots. They have actually 3 abbots, not just one abbot. 3 abbots and no castello. I think that's one of their problems, is they don't have a castello for all those abbots. But anyway, they got all this hierarchical structure. Hundreds of people are part of this hierarchy, and then they have thousands of people who are part of the student structure, and they've got at least 3 campuses. I don't know if you call them campuses. They got Tazahara, they got the city center, they've got Green Gulch, and they may have other things I don't even know about. And they've got this huge bureaucracy. Okay, if you got that kind of thing, well, maybe you need to have a written policy governing what to do about romantic involvement between the teacher class or the priestly class and the student class. Angel City Zen Center was not like that. We would get, on average, I would say between 8 to 10 maybe people coming each. When did we meet? We met on Saturdays and Tuesdays, I think one weekday and Saturdays. I can't remember what the weekday was. I don't know why I can't remember. But we get between 8 and 10 people. Rarely would we get as many as 15 people. I don't know. There were a handful of times when we got more than 15 people. But so it's a really small group. And I wanted to keep it really small. That was my view. In fact, I said this often. I said, we are not interested in growing this center. Because this discussion would come up often. How can we grow the center? I'm saying, no, we don't want to grow this center. I want to keep it to, just the 10 people who come here regular. So everybody knew everybody else. And I didn't want to have this priest class. This was a big mistake I made, and I really feel terrible about it, was that I ordained priests at the Angel City Zen Center. And all of my priest ordinations were, frankly, bullcrap. I'm trying not to use bad words on this, but anyway. Because I got no business ordaining priests. I was Dharma transmitted, but I was Dharma transmitted by a teacher who only did Dharma transmission, which is a different thing from ordaining a priest. So the reason I ordained priests at all was because I kept going out of town. I was gone a lot, and I had sort of deputized, I don't know if that's the word, I'd kind of picked 3 people who were sort of people who'd been there a long time, to kind of lead the group whenever I was away. And there was an incident when I was away when somebody had come to the group newly and said, oh, what about, I want to come back when the real teacher is here. And I thought, I don't want people to think there's not a real teacher. So I decided to do this thing where I would give a priest ordination. But I explained to everybody who I gave the priest ordination, or I thought I explained it, I tried to explain it, that this isn't a real priest ordination. This is sort of like a little formality I'm doing to make everybody feel good about it. But you understand that you're not really priests. You're just kind of, this is kind of something I'm doing so we'll be able to say that you're really teachers in this thing. But we're not establishing a priest class, and this isn't going to go any further than this. And like I say, it was a bad thing to do, and I should never have done it. I thought the people I had ordained were mature enough to kind of handle it without everything going to their heads, but it kind of went to their heads a little bit. And there was one person especially who it really went to his head, and he was the one I didn't even want to ordain this guy as a priest at all. He sort of gave me this story about how he needed this priest ordination so he could complete this sort of thing he was doing in a military thing he was working on. It's a long story. And I was like, well, it's not a real priest ordination. I don't know if the military is going to accept this. And he's like, but I need it. And I'm like, okay. And then as soon as I did it, within I don't know how long, very quickly after I did this priest ordination, he dropped out of that program. So I'm like, is that, what just happened here? And anyway, he was the one who kind of pushed me out of my own Zen center because he really wanted to be the head of the organization. And there's a whole story about why I'm no longer involved in the Angel City Zen Center, because he wanted to be the Angel City Zen Center. But that's a whole other story. We'll leave it for another day. But anyway, so I had this situation where I was sort of this sort of board of directors that I'd established, or was established around me anyway, because we had to have a board of directors, was pushing for this written document which would spell out how romances between the teacher class, the priest class, and the student class had to be conducted. And it had to be a written document, and we had to write it all out and figure it out. And I had no input into this document because I didn't think we needed it in the first place. And they're pushing it. And finally, this horrible document is done. And they're like, well, you got to sign it now. Like, I got to sign it. Brad's got to sign it. Like, oh, Brad. So I'm like, really didn't want to do this. I finally signed the damn thing. And other things had been kind of pushed on me, but this one was like, up until then, it got worse, and I don't want to tell the story about the worst one, at least in this video. But I started to see how these things happen, because here I was being kind of railroaded into signing this document that I didn't want to sign. And now that I've signed this document goes out as part of the teachings of Brad Warner. So I'm kind of looking at this going, oh, this is how this stuff works. So you get this group, this institution, who kind of traps the teacher into it. There's Ziggy. He's right in front of me, like being my little audience while I'm telling this story. Anyway, you get this institution formed around the teacher who are kind of forcing the teacher to acquiesce to things that the teacher might not want to do. And then these things are retroactively, I don't know if that's the word I want, anyway, these things are presented then later on as the teachings of the teacher, that the teacher didn't even want to teach in the first place. So I found myself doing a lot of that. That was the kind of, well, one of the worst ones. Little things like that kept coming up all the time, and then they're kind of forced on me and then later on presented as if they come from me. And I started to think about things like the Pali Canon. And I started to think, well, how much of the Pali Canon really came from Gautama Buddha? And how much of it was sort of forced on Gautama Buddha by the people, the institution that he'd set up? And how much of it was just stuck in there after Gautama Buddha was dead and couldn't protest about it anymore and couldn't put his foot down anymore, and they just stuck it in there. Oh yeah, Gautama Buddha said this, and he said that, and he said this other thing too. Here he goes, and yeah, look, it's the teachings of Gautama Buddha. Here we go. And it's just a bunch of stuff created by this institution. So the institution kind of traps you and puts you into that thing. And it's not exactly one-to-one related with this stuff about the Dalai Lama, but I can see how you get into this situation where maybe in the Dalai Lama's situation, he's got it, people are saying, think about the refugees, think about the refugees. We really need that money for the refugees. Well, I don't know about this Shoko Asahara guy. Oh, we really need that money for the refugees. Just pose for a couple pictures with him. That'll be, well, I'm not sure if it's a good idea to pose with this guy because he's kind of crazy. Well, no, you really need the money for the refugees. Okay, just pose for him. That'll be fine. Then there you go. So, all kinds of things. So this is why I don't really trust things like, there's a whole, the Theravada school of Buddhism is this whole school of Buddhism based on the idea that the Pali Canon is the authentic teachings of Buddha. And I've often said, if you've watched this channel, that I'm kind of dubious about the Pali Canon as being the authentic teachings of Buddha. And that's one of the reasons. And the other sutras are the same, but the Pali Canon to me is one of the most suspicious of all the many documents that's presented as the teachings of Buddha. I mean, things like the Lotus Sutra are obviously not even the teachings of Buddha, which is one of the reasons I find the Lotus Sutra to be a little less suspicious of the Pali Canon, because it doesn't even really pretend to be. I mean, it pretends to be on the surface, because it says the Buddha said, but everybody kind of knows the Buddha didn't really say that. It's kind of, we know it's a work of fiction. I don't think, well, anyway, we could talk about that at length, but I don't want to go there because that's a whole other story. Anyway, that's kind of what I wanted to say. Now everybody's mad at me because they think I want to... The thing about the written document of how teachers should relate to students, or romantic relationship between teachers and students. The thing is, I watched Nishijima Roshi's group in Japan, and they lasted 20, maybe 30 years without ever having a written document like that. And that was the group I was trying to emulate. I was trying to kind of make a continuation of the Nishijima Roshi group in America. And they'd lasted 20 or 30 years without having a written document about how teachers should have romances with students. They just, when things like that came up, they just handled them on a case-by-case basis. They didn't have to go back. The fact that the group was demanding this document made me think, oh, they may be going, oh yeah, when I say I don't want this group to be bigger. But what they're really thinking is, yeah, one of these days we're going to make this group really big. And we're going to want to have this document. Because why do you want to have a document when you can discuss it one-on-one? The only reason to have a document is because you're going to have a group so big that you're going to have to go look at the document to figure out what to do. I mean, I think it's silly to have to look at a document for something like that. You just deal with the problem as it comes up. unless you're a giant institution, then I guess you got to look at a document. But when you're only 8 or 10 people, you don't really have to look at a document to figure out what you're supposed to do. Anyway, that's my opinion. Maybe you don't like my opinion. Anyway, that's what I got to say about that. So, if you want to donate to me saying more things that make you mad, you can go to the URL that you are seeing on the screen below, which is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. There you will find links to my PayPal and Patreon accounts. Those are my main and usually only ways of making a living, and I appreciate your support. But as always, this is offered for free, so you don't got to support me if you don't want to support me. We will see you next time. Have a good time all the time. Bye. Did you enjoy the show? Did you like my show? Did you like the talk I gave? Do you agree with me? You agree with everything I say, right? Of course you do, because you're my good buddy. All right, let's go edit the video.
You came into my mind and everything looked as though it was all mine. Loveliness to gaze upon, to feel your magic pulling me away. I thought I was on top of it all. Everyone else was so small. But I knew what you wanted to do. I knew what you wanted to do. Often think of times when all your thoughts and words came close to making me lose my mind. Only now recalling all the time involving minutes that we spent alone. I thought I was on top of it all. Everyone else was so small. But I knew what you wanted to do. I knew what you wanted to do. Into my mind and everything looked as though it was all mine. Loveliness to gaze upon, to feel your magic pull me away. I thought I was on top of it all. Everyone else was so small.